Boone County, Iowa, November 1974. The air held the flat, metallic taste of impending winter. Vernon Halbur, at 78 years old, performed a ritual he'd honored for 2 decades. He stood at the bottom of the simple wooden staircase in the center of his strange, cylindrical home, a strip of the Des Moines Register twisted into a taper in his hand. His wife, Elaine, watched from the kitchen, the gesture as familiar to her as the sunrise. Vernon struck a match, lit the paper, and held the smoking spire beneath the 3-by-3-foot opening in the ceiling. The thin ribbon of gray smoke did not drift or curl. It rose, straight and true, accelerating as it passed through the hatch into the second story above, a silent, steady river of air flowing upward. Vernon gave a single, satisfied nod. The house was breathing correctly. Miles away, in the warmth of the Ogden Cafe, the air was thick with coffee, cigarette smoke, and casual cruelty. 12 men, farmers, a feed salesman, the clerk from the Rural Electrification Administration, were gathered around a table. The subject, as it often was when the first cold snap hit, was Vernon Halbur's house. Dale Kinner, a contractor of 43 whose new ranch homes were sprouting across the county, took a pen from his shirt pocket. He smoothed out a napkin. With a few quick, confident strokes, he sketched 2 barrels, one stacked clumsily on top of the other. A collective chuckle went around the table. "Heard from Elaine he's getting ready for another winter in that thing," Dale said, his voice pitched for the whole room to hear. He tapped the top barrel on his drawing. Still can't figure out what he was thinking. I guess warm air climbs barrels now. Younger couples in nearby booths grinned into their coffee mugs. Curtis Moline, the REA clerk, offered a thin, non-committal smile. The laughter was easy. Vernon's house was a long-running joke, a piece of local folklore. It was the foolish thing a man builds when he has more strange ideas than good sense. What did this retired Iowa farmer, a man who'd once maintained Navy machine sheds on the sweltering island of Guam, understand about airflow and thermal buoyancy that a modern contractor with a portfolio of financed, professionally designed ranch homes had completely missed? Stick with us, and you'll learn the fundamental physics of how heat moves and why a house built to cooperate with nature will always outperform one designed to fight it. We read every comment, so tell us below. What's the most unconventional but effective solution to a problem you've ever seen? Your story helps this community grow. Vernon Halbur was not a carpenter. He was not an engineer or an architect. He was a man who understood soil, hogs, and the unforgiving logic of a Midwest winter. Before that, he had been a Seabee in the United States Navy, stationed in Guam in 1945. His world then was not one of timber framing and shingles, but of corrugated steel sheets, rivet guns, and the relentless pressure of a tropical sun. He spent his days inside the cavernous, half-cylindrical steel buildings the military called Quonset huts. The other men complained about the heat, the way the sun baked the metal until the air inside was a shimmering, suffocating blanket. But Vernon, a farmer accustomed to observing systems, noticed something else. He saw how the intense solar radiation on the curved roof created a powerful temperature differential. He saw how opening the vents at the bottom and the top of the structure turned the entire building into an engine. It created a powerful, silent, unceasing draft that pulled cooler air in and exhausted hot air out. He saw the physics at play. The building breathed. When he returned to Iowa after the war, he brought that memory with him. He married Elaine, a woman of quiet strength and deep practicality. They started a family, welcoming a son, John, and a daughter, Sarah. They farmed their land, but they needed a home, and money was scarce. In 1953, he saw an advertisement for military surplus. The government was selling off hundreds of the very same Quonset huts he'd worked on in the Pacific. He bought two, each 48 feet long and 20 feet wide, for a total of $640. The neighbors assumed he was building a large machine shed. When they saw him pour a concrete slab and begin assembling the first Quonset, they nodded. It made sense. When he hired a crane from Marshalltown to lift the second, identical Quonset, and stack it directly on top of the first, the nodding stopped. It was replaced by stares of profound confusion. He wasn't building a shed. He was building a home, a 2-story silo, a house made of tin cans. The mockery began then, a low murmur of disbelief that would last for the next 20 years. Vernon ignored it. He was solving a problem, not entering a beauty contest. He remembered the heat engine of Guam, but his challenge now was the opposite. In the Pacific, the goal was to vent the heat out. In an Iowa winter, the goal was to trap it, to hold on to every precious British thermal unit. He realized that if he reversed the principle, generating heat at the bottom instead of the top, the same powerful physics would apply. Instead of an engine for cooling, his stacked Quonsets would become an engine for warmth. He would trap the rising heat in the upper chamber where his family slept. Elaine, trusting his vision over the neighbors' whispers, simply asked where he wanted the kitchen. And in a simple seed corn notebook, she began to write down the date, the outside temperature, and the temperature in their upstairs bedroom, a record she would keep for the next quarter century. By 1974, the conventional wisdom on home building in Boone County had solidified, and Dale Kinner was its chief evangelist. His signature design was the modern ranch, a long, low rectangle of a house, often with a sprawling, uninsulated basement and an attached 2-car garage. These homes were symbols of progress and prosperity, a clean break from the drafty, upright farmhouses of the past. They were comfortable, spacious, and completely, utterly dependent on a constant supply of electricity and propane. The core of their design was a forced air furnace. A powerful electric blower, consuming hundreds of watts, would roar to life several times an hour, pushing heated air through a complex network of sheet metal ducts. The entire system was an act of brute force, designed to fight the fundamental laws of physics. Warm air wants to rise. Dale Kinner's houses declared that it would go where it was told. The blower shoved the warm air down into the living spaces, trying to overcome the natural stratification that occurred. Much of this expensive heated air was immediately lost. It leaked through countless tiny gaps in the construction, was sucked into the cold mass of the concrete basement foundation, or was radiated away through large, single-pane picture windows. The families who bought these homes, like the Petersons and the Schmidts, accepted this as the cost of modern comfort. They paid their high propane bills and called a serviceman when the furnace acted up. They had fiberglass insulation, the latest technology, rolled out between the joists in their attics, but this only slowed the heat's escape from the very top of the house. It did nothing to address the constant, energy-intensive war being waged against gravity and convection within their walls. Their long, horizontal pipe runs for plumbing were stretched out across chilly crawl spaces or unheated basements, a network of vulnerabilities just waiting for a deep freeze. Curtis Moline, sitting at his desk at the REA Cooperative, saw the data that told the real story. He saw the kilowatt hours ticking up year after year. He saw the strain on the grid during a cold snap as thousands of furnace blowers and electric heaters kicked on simultaneously. The new homes were comfortable, yes, but they were also fragile. Their comfort was predicated on a delicate, unbroken chain of fuel deliveries and electrical transmission. It was a philosophy of building that assumed the system would never fail. Dale Kinner sold homes that impressed the neighbors. He never considered what it would take to survive a winter that broke the system. The construction of the Halbur home in the summer of 1953 was a local spectacle. Vernon, with the help of a few skeptical relatives, laid out the forms, and poured the concrete slab himself. The foundation was simple, a monolithic slab 4 inches thick, with a deepened perimeter to act as a footing. There would be no basement to suck warmth from the house. The first Quonset went up quickly. The corrugated steel arches were bolted together on the ground and then tilted up into place, one by one. It was repetitive, logical work, familiar from his time in the Navy. The structure was incredibly strong, its semicircular shape naturally resistant to the powerful Iowa winds. Then came the day the crane arrived. It was a lumbering, beastly machine that groaned its way down the county road. The operator, a man named Henderson, looked at the second Quonset, assembled and waiting on the ground, then at the first, already bolted to the foundation. He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "You're sure about this, Vernon?" he'd asked. Vernon just nodded. "Lift it from the center. I've marked the balance points." The process was slow and nerve-wracking. The huge steel shell, weighing several thousand pounds, swung precariously in the air. Vernon directed the placement with hand signals, sighting down the edges to ensure perfect alignment. The lower hut's roof arch had to become the upper hut's floor support. With painstaking precision, the second cylinder was lowered onto the first. For the rest of the day, Vernon and his son, John, drilled holes and drove bolts, permanently wedding the two structures into a single, bizarre unit. Next, he took a reciprocating saw and cut a 3-foot by 3-foot square hole directly in the center of the floor of the upper hut, which was also the ceiling of the lower one. He framed the opening with welded angle iron, creating a rigid, permanent passageway. This simple hatch was the heart of the entire system. It was the valve that would allow the house to breathe. The layout was dictated by physics. The downstairs was one large, open space housing the kitchen, the living area, and a small workshop for Vernon. The source of heat was a cast-iron cook stove, centrally located so its radiant energy could warm the entire lower level. The upstairs, accessed by a steep but sturdy set of wooden stairs that ran alongside the hatch, was divided into bedrooms. This was the designated heat trap, the reservoir of warmth where the family would sleep. For insulation, Vernon used a method almost as strange as the house itself. Instead of fiberglass bats, he hired a company from Des Moines that specialized in insulating cold storage lockers. They sprayed a thick 2-inch layer of polyurethane foam directly onto the interior surface of the steel walls. The foam expanded to fill every crack and seam, creating a seamless, monolithic barrier against the cold. It was expensive, but it eliminated thermal bridging through the steel ribs and created an airtight envelope. The mockery was constant and direct. Dale Kinner's father, a respected builder in his own right, stopped by one afternoon. He walked around the structure, shaking his head. "Vernon, that steel is going to sweat on the inside something fierce," he warned. "You've got no attic, no ventilation between the roof and the ceiling. All that moisture from cooking and breathing has nowhere to go. It'll condense on that cold metal and rain inside your house. You'll rot out in 5 years." It was a legitimate criticism, based on decades of conventional building experience. Vernon listened politely. When the elder Kinner was finished, he simply replied, "The heat will keep it dry." He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain the complex airflow dynamics he envisioned. He just went back to work, confident in the principles he had observed halfway around the world. The mockery lasted through the fall. The validation would last a lifetime. To understand why Vernon Halbur's strange house worked so brilliantly, you have to understand 3 simple principles of physics: thermal buoyancy, stratification, and radiant heat transfer. Dale Kinner's houses were built in defiance of these principles. Vernon's was built in celebration of them. The first principle is the most basic. Warm air is less dense and therefore lighter than cold air. This is thermal buoyancy. When you heat air, it expands, and like a cork in water, it rises. In a standard box-shaped room with a flat 8-foot ceiling, this rising hot air pools uselessly against the drywall, often creating a 10 to 15 degree temperature difference between the ceiling and the floor. A forced air furnace tries to solve this problem by using a powerful fan to churn the air, mixing the hot and cold together. This is an energy-intensive process, like trying to keep oil and water mixed by constantly stirring them. This natural separation of air by temperature is called thermal stratification. Vernon's house didn't fight stratification, it used it. The ground floor was the engine room. The wood cook stove, capable of producing over 30,000 BTUs of heat, warmed the air around it. This newly buoyant air immediately began its journey upward. In a square room, it would have hit a flat ceiling and spread out. But in the Quonset, the continuously curved walls acted as a funnel. All rising air was naturally directed toward the highest point at the center of the arch. And what was at that high point? The hatch. The hatch wasn't just a hole, it was a passive thermal valve, a chimney without fire. It created a stable, continuous, low-velocity column of rising warm air. Think of it not as a vent, but as the intake for the second story. This gentle, constant flow, perhaps only 50 cubic feet per minute, moved heat from where it was made to where it was needed, using zero electrical energy. It was silent, automatic, and powered by the laws of physics themselves. Once upstairs, the warm air entered the second Quonset, which functioned as a dedicated heat trap. Again, the curved ceiling was critical. There were no high, cold corners for heat to get lost in or for cool air to stagnate. The warm air would rise to the apex of the upper arch and then, as it slowly cooled, would gently descend along the curved walls, creating a slow, continuous circulation loop. The entire upper story became a reservoir of stable, evenly distributed warmth. The spray foam insulation prevented this trapped heat from escaping. The final piece was radiant heat. The interior steel walls, warmed by the circulating air, radiated that warmth back into the room, heating objects and people directly, a far more comfortable feeling than being blasted with hot, dry air from a vent. The problem in a conventional house wasn't a lack of heat. The problem was that the heat was in the wrong place and constantly trying to escape. Vernon didn't invent a new way to make heat. He simply built a better, smarter container to hold it. The blizzard began on a Tuesday in January of 1978. For days, the forecasts had been grim, but nothing prepared central Iowa for the reality. It started not with gentle flakes, but with a furious, horizontal scouring of ice pellets driven by a 50-mile-per-hour wind. The temperature, which had been a mild 20 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, plunged. By nightfall, it was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill the radio announcers claimed was minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow wasn't falling. It was a solid, roaring river of white that erased the world. Across Boone County, the fragile infrastructure of modern life began to snap. The first to go were the power lines. Weighted down with ice and thrashed by the wind, they began to fail. At the REA Cooperative, Curtis Moline watched in the emergency-lit control room as entire sections of the county map went dark. One by one, the lights winked out. For thousands of people, the silent hum of the furnace blower, the background noise of winter survival, ceased. Inside Dale Kinner's handsome ranch house, the silence was terrifying. The thermostat was a useless ornament on the wall. Dale's wife, Carol, stuffed bath towels against the bottom of the doors, a futile gesture against the immense cold pressing in on them. Within an hour, the temperature inside had dropped 20 degrees. Their two young children, huddled under a pile of blankets on the sofa, were shivering. Then came a sharp bang from the basement, a sound like a rifle shot. A copper pipe, frozen solid, had burst. Water began to pool on the concrete floor, where it would soon turn to a sheet of ice. The house, a symbol of modern security, had become a freezing, vulnerable trap. At the Halbur home, the lights were out too. But the house was far from silent. There was the gentle crackle of oak burning in the cook stove, the soft hiss of the coffee percolator, and the low murmur of Vernon and Elaine's conversation. The storm raging outside was a spectacle, not a threat. Vernon, as a test, lit another strip of newspaper. He held it below the hatch. The smoke flowed upward, a steady, unwavering plume. The house was breathing perfectly, its passive heat engine unperturbed by the storm. The contrast was stark and measurable. Outside, the temperature held at a brutal -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Dale Kinner's living room, the thermometer read 38 degrees Fahrenheit and was still falling. His family could see their breath. In Vernon Halbur's downstairs kitchen, the air was a comfortable 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Upstairs, in the bedrooms where they would sleep, the old mercury thermometer on the wall, the one Elaine had recorded in her notebooks for 25 years, registered a calm and steady 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The ultimate proof of the system's success was a small, mundane detail. On the windowsill of Dale Kinner's kitchen, a glass of water left out had frozen solid. Frost was blooming in feathery patterns on the inside of his new, expensive double-pane windows. In the Halbur's upstairs bedroom, Elaine had left a stick of butter on a plate on the windowsill, preparing to make cookies the next day. In the heart of the worst blizzard in a generation, with no electricity, the butter remained soft enough to spread. The cold had been so completely and utterly defeated that the normal functions of a kitchen could continue uninterrupted. The phone lines, running on battery backup at the central office, were one of the last links to the outside world. They worked in fits and starts. Dale Kinner, his own home becoming uninhabitable, managed to get a call through to a neighbor whose own pipes had just burst. The question was frantic, repeated up and down the rural party lines. "Are you warm? Is anyone warm?" The answer that came back was always the same. No. Then someone remembered the old man in the tin can house. A call was placed. Elaine answered. "Oh, we're just fine," she said calmly. "Vernon's keeping the stove going. It's plenty warm up here." The words spread with the speed of desperation. Vernon Halbur's place was warm. It wasn't a rescue mission. It was a migration. The first to arrive were the closest neighbors, the Schmidts, on a tractor, their children wrapped in horse blankets. Then came others on snowmobiles. Finally, Dale Kinner arrived. His family packed into the cab of his Ford pickup, which he'd managed to start after an hour of effort. In all, 23 people, shivering and stunned, made their way through the blizzard to the strange, double-stacked Quonset hut. When Dale stepped inside, the physical sensation was jarring. He had braced himself for what he knew of failed houses. A small pocket of oppressive heat right next to a stove, surrounded by a vast, penetrating cold. He expected to feel the damp chill of steel, the bitter drafts from every seam. Instead, he was enveloped in an even, radiant warmth. The air was still and dry. There were no drafts. He looked at his children, their faces already regaining color, their shivering subsiding. He walked to the center of the room and looked up at the open hatch. He could feel it, a sensation he'd never experienced before, a silent, gentle, invisible column of warmth rising into the story above. It was undeniable. He walked to the wall and placed his bare palm flat against the cold rolled steel. He expected the biting cold that would numb his hand in seconds. But the wall was only cool to the touch. It wasn't sweating. It wasn't even cold. It was stable. Vernon saw him and simply gestured toward the kitchen. "Elaine's got soup on," he said. "Find a spot." There was no triumph in his voice, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only the quiet competence of a man whose work had been proven correct. Later that night, Dale went upstairs. The children, the Schmidts, the others, were all sleeping soundly on blankets and mattresses on the floor. The air was warm and fresh. He stood there for a long time, watching them, listening to the wind howl harmlessly outside. He walked back down the stairs and found Vernon sitting by the stove. He didn't apologize for 20 years of jokes. He didn't recant his criticism. He simply paid Vernon the highest compliment a builder could give another, by reframing the very nature of his creation. "You didn't build a house, Vernon," Dale said, his voice quiet with an awe that bordered on reverence. "You built a slow-motion chimney." In the aftermath of the blizzard of '78, the legend of Vernon Halbur's barrel house was rewritten. It was no longer a story of foolishness, but one of uncanny wisdom. Curtis Moline, the REA clerk who had sheltered there that night, was instrumental in this transformation. He had spent hours talking with Vernon, poring over Elaine's notebooks filled with decades of temperature data. He saw the pattern, the undeniable efficiency of the design. At county emergency planning meetings, Curtis presented his findings. He didn't advocate for everyone to stack Quonset huts. Instead, he promoted the core principle: passive survivability. He used Vernon's data to show how a house designed to work with natural convection could maintain livable temperatures for days without external power. The numbers were irrefutable. Vernon's home, over a 25-year average, used 40% less supplemental propane for heating than a Kinner-built ranch of comparable square footage. The concept began to seep into the local consciousness. Farmers building new machine shops started using steeper roof pitches and central vents to manage heat. A few people retrofitted their homes with small, closable vents between floors, a direct copy of Vernon's hatch, to be used during power outages. The idea of cooperating with heat's natural desire to rise was no longer a strange theory. It was a proven survival strategy. What Vernon Halbur had built in 1953 with surplus military parts and memories of a tropical island was a startlingly aesthetically effective precursor to concepts that modern building science would formally name decades later. His house was a masterclass based in the stack effect, the principle that drives air movement in buildings due to temperature differences. The entire two-story structure, with its central heat source and upper-level vent, functioned as a passive solar collector in reverse. Instead of trapping the sun's heat, it trapped its own internal heat. It was, in its own way, a primitive heat recovery ventilator, using the entire upper story as a thermal storage, engine, and distribution plenum. He was decades ahead of his time, not because of formal education, but because of careful observation and a profound respect for the laws of nature. There is a fundamental difference between building a house that looks successful and building one that is successful. Dale Kinner's ranch homes were designed to look good in a real estate listing. They had curb appeal, manicured lawns, and big-picture windows that framed a pleasant view on a sunny afternoon in June. They were statements of financial achievement, built on the assumption of an uninterrupted world, a world where the power grid was infallible and propane trucks always ran on time. They were designed to impress the neighbors. Vernon Halbur built a house designed for the worst night in January. It was not a statement. It was an answer. It was the solution to a brutal, practical problem: how to keep a family safe and warm when the world outside is trying to freeze them. His design was an act of humility, an admission that the forces of nature are more powerful than any furnace. The unforgiving Iowa landscape doesn't reward architectural trends or the size of a home loan. It rewards a deep, unsentimental understanding of thermal dynamics. It rewards what works. Vernon and Elaine lived in their Quonset home until 1998. In his later years, he would take his grandchildren up the steep stairs and have them hold their hands over the hatch to feel the warm, rising air. He'd light a strip of newspaper and let them watch the smoke get pulled upward, teaching them to see the invisible river that kept them warm. Years later, in the fall of 2002, Dale Kinner, now gray-haired and semi-retired, was overseeing a small construction project. He overheard a young framer mocking a neighbor's new workshop, a simple, round-roofed metal shed. "Look at that thing," the young man laughed. "Who'd build a round roof on purpose?" Dale walked over, his expression unreadable. He looked at the shed, then at the young man. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mention the blizzard or the night he and his family spent huddled in another man's home. He just spoke a quiet truth, learned over 36 hours of freezing darkness. "Depends," Dale said softly, turning to walk away. "Depends on how the heat moves." If you enjoyed this story of practical ingenuity, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten wisdom. Your support allows us to continue this work. Let us know in the comments, have you ever had to rely on an old, low-tech solution during a modern system failure? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building method today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.